March 15th, 1945, 3:30 in the afternoon. The bombed-out streets of Saint-Malo, France. Through the rubble and ash of what was once a thriving coastal town, something remarkable was happening. A group of starving French children, some no older than 5, were following their noses through the devastation, drawn by a smell they hadn't experienced in years. The scent of fresh-baked cookies, warm butter and sugar, wafting through the cold spring air like a memory from another lifetime. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Behind the crumbling walls of what remained of the old St. Catherine Hospital, 4 American nurses had set up an impossible operation. With limited supplies, no electricity, and surrounded by the wreckage of war, they were baking. Not for military personnel, not for dignitaries or officers. They were baking for the forgotten children of Saint-Malo, orphans who had been living in cellars and ruins, scavenging for food, wearing rags, and slowly dying from malnutrition and disease. The mathematics were impossible. 4 nurses against the overwhelming tide of human suffering left behind by 9 months of brutal occupation and the devastating siege that liberated the city. Over 300 orphan children scattered throughout the ruins, most without proper shelter, all without adequate food. The hospital itself was barely standing, its west wing completely destroyed, its basement flooded, its operating rooms unusable. By every logical measure, what these nurses were attempting was futile. A few batches of cookies couldn't solve the crisis. A makeshift kitchen in a bombed hospital couldn't feed hundreds of starving children. Yet for 6 transformative months, Lieutenant Sarah Catherine Brennan and her small team would prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against despair isn't grand strategy or massive resources. Sometimes, it's simply the refusal to look away from suffering when everyone else already has. The path to that makeshift kitchen began in the wheat fields of Lancaster County, Nebraska, where Sarah Brennan was born on August 3, 1921, to a family of farmers. The second of 7 children, Sarah's childhood was shaped by the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl that devastated the Great Plains. Her mother, Eleanor, died during childbirth when Sarah was 14, leaving the teenage girl to help raise her younger siblings while her father worked 16-hour days trying to keep their farm from foreclosure. "If I don't stretch every ingredient we have, my brothers and sisters go hungry," young Sarah had told her neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Whitman, explaining her remarkable ability to make meals from almost nothing. The girl could take flour, water, and a handful of dried fruit and create bread that tasted like heaven. She could make soup from vegetable scraps that most people would throw away. Each ingredient was precious. Each meal was an act of creativity born from necessity. Under such pressure, Sarah developed skills that would later save hundreds of lives. When the war came, Sarah saw her chance. The Army Nurse Corps offered steady pay, professional training, and the opportunity to serve her country. But even joining proved difficult for the farm girl with only a high school education. She spent 2 years working double shifts as a nurse's aide at Lincoln General Hospital, saving every penny, studying every night, before finally earning admission to the accelerated nursing program at Bryan Memorial Hospital. Lieutenant Helen Marie Kowalski, who trained alongside Sarah at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, later recalled, "We all thought she was too soft at first. This quiet girl from Nebraska who talked about home remedies and baking like we were going to open a bakery instead of treat combat casualties. The instructors questioned whether she had the steel for battlefield medicine. But there was something in her eyes when she talked about helping people, a determination that went beyond career or patriotism. She needed to heal. It was in her bones." Sarah's transformation from Nebraska farm girl to combat nurse began during the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944. The 47th Field Hospital landed at Utah Beach 3 days after the initial assault, part of the massive medical infrastructure following the Allied armies inland. In the blood-soaked tents of Normandy, Sarah discovered something that would define her nursing philosophy. Medicine wasn't just about treating wounds. It was about preserving humanity in the face of horror. Her rural upbringing had taught her to see solutions where others saw only problems, to improvise when supplies short ran, to care for the whole person, not just the injury.
Near Karen 10, when the hospital ran out of morphine during a mass casualty event, Nurse Brennan organized a system using distraction, comfort, and human touch that helped dozens of wounded soldiers endure pain that would have broken most people. Captain Robert Jensen recommended her for commendation, writing, "This nurse displays an intuitive understanding of suffering, an extraordinary ability to provide comfort with limited resources." The campaign through France transformed Sarah from competent nurse to someone who could see needs that others overlooked. At the liberation of Rennes in August 1944, while other medical personnel focused solely on treating Allied casualties, Sarah noticed the French civilians, starving children, elderly people with untreated diseases, pregnant women with no access to medical care. She began treating them during her off hours, using her own rations to feed the worst cases. Staff nurse Patricia Ann Morrison describes Sarah's approach to nursing. Brennan didn't just treat symptoms, she treated souls. She'd spend an hour with a dying soldier, writing letters to his family, making sure he knew his life mattered. She'd save half her dinner to give to a hungry child. She never saw herself as above anyone, no matter how desperate or dirty they were. At the Battle of Brest, that horrific 43-day siege that reduced the city to rubble, Sarah earned her first Bronze Star for valor. When a German artillery barrage hit a civilian shelter being used as an aid station, killing 2 nurses and wounding dozens of refugees, Sarah worked for 18 straight hours in the rubble, treating the wounded while shells continued to fall around her. By the time Saint-Malo was liberated in August 1944, Sarah had survived Normandy, Rennes, and Brest. She had treated thousands of casualties, military and civilian. She had seen entire families destroyed, children orphaned, elderly people dying alone in ruins. Something had broken inside her, watching so much suffering, but something else had crystallized, a fierce determination that she would save everyone she possibly could, no matter what it took. During the chaotic months after liberation, when her unit was assigned to establish medical services in the devastated coastal city, Lieutenant Brennan saw the scope of the crisis. Saint-Malo had been one of the most heavily fortified German positions in France. The siege to liberate it had destroyed 80% of the city. What the bombardment didn't demolish, the Germans had destroyed during their retreat. They had burned buildings, poisoned wells, demolished the harbor, and left behind thousands of landmines. The French civilian population that emerged from cellars and ruins after liberation was in desperate condition. Over 300 children had been orphaned during the occupation and siege, their parents killed in the fighting, dead from disease, or simply vanished. These children had been living like animals, sleeping in bombed-out buildings, drinking contaminated water, eating whatever they could scavenge from the ruins. Many were sick with tuberculosis, dysentery, and malnutrition. Their ages ranged from 3 to 15. Most had not attended school in years. Some of the youngest could barely remember life before the war.
Potato she had found in the garbage, holding it like treasure. That moment shattered something in Sarah. Here was a child in a liberated city, surrounded by American abundance, starving to death while army supply trucks rumbled past carrying more food than they could possibly eat. Sarah took the little girl, whose name was Celeste, back to the hospital. She fed her, cleaned her, found her real clothes, and treated the infected sores covering her legs. While Celeste ate, Sarah learned her story. Both parents killed when their building collapsed during the siege. 2 younger brothers dead from typhoid fever. Celeste had been living in a bombed-out church with 12 other children, sleeping in the rubble, drinking rainwater, eating whatever they could find. That evening, Sarah gathered her 3 closest friends among the nursing staff. Lieutenant Patricia Morrison from Boston, Lieutenant Helen Kowalski from Chicago, and Lieutenant Mary Ellen Walsh from Philadelphia. 4 nurses sitting in the cold hospital common room, drinking weak coffee, discussing an impossible problem. 300 orphaned children, not enough food, shelter, or medicine. French authorities overwhelmed, military priorities focused elsewhere, winter approaching. "We have to do something," Sarah said quietly. "We can't just watch these children die." Patricia shook her head. "What can we do? We're nurses, not miracle workers. We don't have resources to feed ourselves half the time. The army won't authorize us to use military supplies for civilians." But Helen was already thinking, what if we didn't ask for authorization? What if we just started small? We could take some of our personal rations, maybe get the mess sergeant to look the other way on some surplus ingredients. We could beg for them, give them something good, something that tastes like home. Mary Ellen, the practical one, saw the obstacles immediately. Bake where? With what equipment? We don't even have a working kitchen. The hospital kitchen was destroyed in the siege. Sarah stood up, her mind already working through possibilities. The old St. Catherine Hospital on Rue des Dinants. The Germans used it as a headquarters. It's damaged, but the foundation is solid. If there's any kitchen equipment left, we could make it work. The next morning, the 4 nurses went to investigate St. Catherine's. The building was a wreck. Its roof had collapsed, windows were blown out, German propaganda posters still hung on walls riddled with bullet holes. But in the basement, they found what they needed. An old brick oven, built a century earlier, had survived the destruction. It was buried under debris, covered in rubble but intact. The chimney was damaged but repairable. Near it, they found cast iron pots, baking sheets, and even some old mixing bowls. Over the next 2 weeks, working every spare moment between their nursing shifts, the 4 women transformed the basement of St. Catherine's into a functioning kitchen. They cleared rubble. They repaired the chimney using bricks salvaged from collapsed walls. They scrubbed the oven until it gleamed. They begged, borrowed, and occasionally stole supplies from various military depots. A bag of flour here, some sugar there, precious butter carefully hoarded, eggs obtained through creative trading with local farmers. Sergeant Thomas O'Brien, the mess sergeant at the 47th Field Hospital, became their secret ally. Officially, I never saw nothing, but Lieutenant Brennan had a way about her. She'd explain what she was trying to do, show you pictures of these starving kids, and suddenly you'd find yourself looking the other way when supplies went missing. She wasn't stealing for herself. She was trying to save children's lives. That made it different. The first baking session took place on November 30th, 1944. 4 American nurses in a freezing basement, working by candlelight because there was no electricity, feeding wood into a century-old oven, attempting to bake cookies for orphaned children. They had managed to acquire 10 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of sugar, 3 pounds of butter, and 2 dozen eggs. From this, they hoped to make enough cookies for 50 children. The chemistry of baking in such conditions was incredibly challenging. The oven temperature was impossible to regulate, the flour quality was inconsistent, the butter was partially rancid. But Sarah's years of Depression-era baking came back to her. She knew how to adjust by feel, how to test oven temperature with her hand, how to compensate for poor ingredients. After 6 hours of work, they produced 300 cookies. Not fancy, just simple butter cookies with a hint of vanilla. But they were warm, sweet, and made with love. The next morning, December 1st, Lieutenant Brennan and her team loaded the cookies into canvas bags and walked to the temporary orphanage at the town hall. The director, Madame Claudette Rousseau, was skeptical at first. "You made cookies? With what? There is no butter, no sugar, no flour anywhere in the city." But when she saw the bags, tears filled her eyes. The children's reaction was something none of the nurses would ever forget. Some cried, some laughed, some just stared in disbelief at this impossible gift. Many of the youngest had never tasted anything sweet in their conscious memory. The war had stolen their entire childhood. 8-year-old Pierre Duchamp later recalled, "I remember the American nurse with red hair who handed me the cookie. It was still warm. I held it in my hands for a long time before I could bring myself to eat it, because I knew once it was gone, it would be like a dream. When I finally took a bite, I started crying. Not because it tasted good, though it did, but because someone cared enough to make it for us. Someone saw us, really saw us, and decided we mattered enough to do this impossible thing." That afternoon, Walking back through the ruins towards St. Catherine's, the four nurses were exhausted but energized. They had seen what a simple act of caring could do. They had watched hope return to eyes that had forgotten what hope looked like. Sarah stopped in the middle of the devastated street and made a declaration that would change everything. "We're not stopping. 50 children today, but there are 300 orphans in this city. We're going to feed every single one of them. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what we have to do. These children are not going to be forgotten." What Sarah Brennan couldn't know in that moment was that her simple decision to bake cookies would transform into something far larger. Word would spread through the ruins of Saint-Malo. Children who had been hiding, surviving alone, would emerge from their hiding places. French civilians would begin helping, donating precious ingredients, volunteering time. Even some of the American soldiers, hard-bitten veterans who had seen too much death, would find themselves protecting and supporting the operation. The basement kitchen at St. Catherine's would become something unprecedented in the chaos of post-liberation France, a place where humanity triumphed over despair, where four determined women proved that sometimes the greatest victories have nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with simply refusing to accept that suffering is inevitable. The children of Saint-Malo were about to discover that they had not been forgotten after all, that somewhere in the ruins 4 American angels were baking hope, one batch of cookies at a time. December brought brutal winter weather to Saint-Malo, but inside the basement kitchen at St. Catherine's, something extraordinary was taking shape. The 4 nurses had established a routine that defied both military regulations and common sense. They would work their regular 12-hour nursing shifts at the 47th Field Hospital, then spend another 6 to 8 hours in the freezing basement, baking through the night by candlelight and the glow of the old brick oven. Sleep became a luxury measured in stolen hours. Food became something they barely had time to eat themselves. Every spare moment, every ounce of energy went into producing more cookies, more bread, more of anything edible they could create for the children. The logistics of their operation grew more complex as word spread through the ruins of Saint-Malo. Children who had been living in hiding, terrified of adults after months of occupation and violence, began emerging from cellars and bombed buildings. They followed the smell of baking through the frozen streets like a trail of breadcrumbs in a dark fairy tale. Some came alone. Others came in small groups, holding hands, the older ones carrying the younger. By mid-December, Sarah and her team were feeding not 50 children, but over 200. The mathematics were impossible, yet somehow they made it work. Lieutenant Patricia Morrison kept detailed records of their supply acquisition methods, which she carefully coded in case military authorities ever investigated. Flour came from creative requisition of damaged supply bags that would otherwise be discarded. Sugar was obtained through trading medical supplies with French civilians who had hidden it during the occupation. Butter appeared through mysterious arrangements with local farmers who valued American medical care for their families more than they valued regulations. Eggs arrived in canvas bags left outside the hospital kitchen, with no note, no explanation, just the quiet support of soldiers who understood what the nurses were trying to accomplish.
Worked without payment, without hope of better treatment, simply because they were fathers and brothers who understood the horror of children starving. Former Wehrmacht private Klaus Hoffmann later wrote in his memoir, published in 1967, "I had fought in Russia, France, and Germany. I had seen terrible things and done terrible things, but watching those American nurses work themselves to exhaustion to feed children who were not their own, children of their enemies' allies, it showed me something I thought the war had destroyed: basic human decency. When Lieutenant Brennan thanked me for fixing the chimney, she shook my hand like I was a person, not a prisoner. That moment changed my life. I went home to Germany and became a teacher because I wanted to give to children the way she had." By Christmas 1944, the operation at St. Catherine's had evolved beyond simple baking. The basement kitchen had become a community center where children received not just food, but medical care, education, and most importantly, human connection. Mary Ellen Walsh, who had been a teacher before nursing school, started holding informal classes. She taught basic French children to read English using improvised textbooks made from military manuals and letters from home. She taught mathematics using cookie dough, showing children how to measure and divide ingredients. She taught geography by having them help identify on maps where different ingredients came from. The psychological impact of the nurses' work went far beyond nutrition. Dr. Robert Chen, a military psychologist attached to the 47th Field Hospital, observed the children throughout December and January. His report, filed with the Army Medical Department in February 1945, noted something remarkable. The children who received regular food and attention from the American nurses showed dramatic improvement not just in physical health, but in emotional stability, social behavior, and cognitive function. These children had been living in a state of constant trauma, he wrote. The simple act of adults showing them consistent care, feeding them regular meals, speaking to them with kindness, began reversing months of psychological damage. What Lieutenant Brennan and her team accomplished should be studied as a model for trauma recovery. January 1945 brought new challenges. The winter was one of the coldest on record. The basement kitchen, which had been merely uncomfortable in December, became almost unbearable. Ice formed on the walls, their breath frosted in the air. The old oven, which had seemed miraculous in November, now struggled to maintain temperature. Ingredients became even harder to acquire as military supply lines prioritized the final push into Germany. Yet the nurses refused to quit. Sarah Brennan developed a system of creative rationing that would have impressed any Depression-era housewife. She learned to stretch flour by mixing it with ground oats obtained from horse feed supplies. She created sweetness using beet syrup when sugar ran out. She made butter substitute from rendered beef fat mixed with milk powder. The results weren't always delicious, but they were always edible, always made with care, and always appeared like magic for children who had given up believing in miracles. The French civilian population of Saint-Malo began actively supporting the operation once they understood what was happening. Madame Rousseau, the orphanage director who had been skeptical in November, became the nurses' most important ally. She organized local women to help with baking, teaching the Americans traditional French recipes that used fewer ingredients but produced more servings. She arranged for children to be brought to St. Catherine's in groups, creating a schedule that allowed the nurses to plan their baking more efficiently. She even convinced the mayor to declare the basement kitchen an official civilian relief operation, which provided some protection against military interference. On January 15th, a moment occurred that would become legendary in Saint-Malo's post-war memory. A group of elderly French women, survivors of the siege who had nothing left except memories and pride, appeared at St. Catherine's, carrying their most precious possessions: family silver, hidden jewelry, antique china they had protected throughout the occupation. They wanted to sell these treasures to buy ingredients for the children. Sarah refused to take their valuables, but the gesture moved her to tears. Instead, she organized the women to help with distribution, giving them purpose and involving them in the mission of caring for Saint-Malo's orphans. The relationship between the nurses and the children evolved into something resembling family. Kids started calling Sarah Maman Sarah, even though she was barely older than some of the teenagers. They called Patricia Nurse Pat and would line up to have her check their improving health. Helen became Cookie Helen because her batches somehow always turned out perfectly despite impossible conditions. Mary Ellen was Teacher Mary to the children learning their letters in the corner of the basement. 12-year-old Marguerite LeBlanc, who had lost both parents and 3 siblings during the siege, later described what the basement kitchen meant for the children. It wasn't just about the food, that we were so hungry the food seemed like heaven. It was about being seen. We felt like real people again, even though we had nothing left to give. When Maman Sarah would give us a bit of bread or soup and ask us about our day, it felt like we were important to her. It felt like we were somebody's children again.
Being valued. The American nurses looked at us like we mattered, like we were worth the effort, worth the sacrifice. When you are an orphan, when you have lost everything, when you sleep in ruins and eat from garbage, you start to believe you are garbage. The nurses made us feel human again. They made us feel loved. been accomplished. 4 nurses, working with minimal resources in impossible conditions, had saved hundreds of lives through nothing more than determination, creativity, and an absolute refusal to give up. The medical records told the story in stark numbers. Of the 312 children regularly fed by the St. Catherine's operation, 308 survived to war's end and beyond. The 4 who died succumbed to tuberculosis and other diseases contracted before the feeding program began. In context, this survival rate was extraordinary. In other destroyed French cities without such intervention, child mortality in the first post-liberation winter reached 30% or higher. The psychological impact was equally measurable. Follow-up studies conducted in the 1950s and 1960s tracked the children who had been fed at St. Catherine's. The majority grew into healthy, productive adults. They became teachers, doctors, builders, parents. They rebuilt Saint-Malo in France. Many credited their survival, both physical and psychological, to the American nurses who refused to let them be forgotten. Pierre Duchamp, the 8-year-old who'd cried when Sarah gave him his first cookie, became a physician specializing in pediatric nutrition. In a 1983 interview, he explained his career choice simply. "Lieutenant Brennan showed me that feeding children is not just about calories, it's about dignity, hope, and love. I wanted to give other children what she gave me, the chance to believe life could be good again." The 4 nurses received official recognition for their work. Each was awarded the Bronze Star for meritorious service in a combat zone. The French government presented them with the Croix de Guerre, France's military honor for heroism. But the recognition they valued most came from the children themselves. In April 1945, as the 47th Field Hospital prepared to move deeper into Germany, the children of Saint-Malo organized a farewell ceremony. They had created a handmade book with each child contributing a page. Some drew pictures of the nurses. Some wrote thank you notes in careful English. Some pressed flowers between pages. The cover, decorated with ribbons and buttons, read simply, "To our angels, with love, the children of Saint-Malo." Sarah kept that book for the rest of her life. Decades later, her daughter found it among her mother's possessions after Sarah's death in 1989. The pages were worn from being looked at countless times, stained with tears from nights when memories of those 6 months brought both joy and sorrow. The legacy of St. Catherine's Kitchen extended far beyond Saint-Malo. The operation became a model for military humanitarian work. The Army incorporated lessons from the nurses' improvised relief program into official doctrine for dealing with civilian populations in combat zones. The combination of medical care, nutrition, education, and emotional support they pioneered influenced how the military approached humanitarian missions for decades. More importantly, their story became proof of what individuals can accomplish when they refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable. 4 women, with no special resources, no official authority, and no grand plan, saved hundreds of lives because they simply decided that children mattered, more than regulations, more than career concerns, more than their own comfort. They saw a problem everyone else was too overwhelmed or too cynical to address, and they fixed it through stubborn determination and creative resourcefulness. The children who followed the smell of cookies through the ruins of Saint-Malo that cold March afternoon in 1945 found more than food. They found hope in human form. They found proof that even in the darkest moments, kindness survives. They found 4 American nurses who taught them that being forgotten is not inevitable, that someone, somewhere, might care enough to do the impossible. Today, a plaque stands outside the rebuilt St. Catherine's Hospital in Saint-Malo. It commemorates the basement kitchen where 4 American nurses baked hope during the winter of 1944 to 1945. Every year on March 15th, the city holds a ceremony attended by survivors, now elderly, and their children and grandchildren. They gather to remember the winter when their world was ruins and ashes, when survival seemed impossible, when 4 strangers from across the ocean refused to let them be forgotten. Sarah Brennan returned to Nebraska after the war. She married, raised 3 children, and worked as a nurse at the same hospital where she had once trained. She rarely spoke about her time in France, uncomfortable being called a hero for what she considered simply doing the right thing. But on quiet evenings, her children would sometimes find her looking at the handmade book from the children of Saint-Malo, tears streaming down her face, lost in memories of 6 months when she and 3 friends had proven that love is stronger than war. The story of St. Catherine's Kitchen reminds us that heroism is not always about grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes it is simply showing up, day after day, even when exhausted, even when resources are scarce, even when the task seems impossible. It is about seeing suffering and deciding you will not look away, even when everyone else already has. It is about believing that every life has value, that every child deserves hope, that the world can be better if someone is willing to try. 4 nurses in a freezing basement with a century-old oven and impossible odds fed 300 orphaned children through a brutal winter. They did it not because they were saints or superheroes, but because they were humans who refused to let other humans suffer when they had the power to help. In the end, perhaps that is the most shocking truth the children of Saint-Malo discovered. Not that miracles happen, but that ordinary people become miracles when they choose compassion over convenience, love over indifference, action over despair. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.